All right. Welcome everyone to our session today, Driving Social Change for Sustainable Decisions. Today, we're inviting a range of youth representatives from different initiatives around the globe to share their inspiring experiences and views on promising mechanisms to foster the linkages between science to support climate action and food systems transformation. Today, first, I would like to introduce you to Dr. Cedric Habiyaremye. He is a research associate at Washington State University, founder and CEO of Quinoa Hub, and co-founder of FarmWalla. Cedric serves as the Rwanda research lead at the Food Systems for the Future and New Voices Fellow at the Aspen Institute. And most significantly, he has 8+ years of experience working in international agricultural development with a focus on research, development, and policy. Welcome, Cedric. And secondly, we have Amanda Namayi. Amanda is passionate about leveraging information communication technology solutions for challenges being faced in the agri sector. Previously, Amanda was Kenya's country ambassador for the Global African Agribusiness Accelerator Platform, regional coordinator for the East Africa for the Climate Smart Agriculture Youth Network, and currently she is a steering committee member for the Youth Alliance for Zero Hunger. Welcome, Amanda.
Thank you.
And finally, today we are joined by Luke Spajic, and he is a food systems research student at the University of Adelaide, Australia. There, he co-founded the Adelaide SDG Hub and member of the Youth Assembly. Luke is interested in understanding and overcoming the barriers leading to the evidence policy gap in food systems and climate change more broadly. Luke was the lead author on an article about the how of the meaningful youth engagement in the Lancet Planetary Health. All right. And with that in mind, I would like to remind our participants before the session, if you're interested in understanding more about this Transforming Food Systems initiative, to download the link, and it should be appearing here, where we detail the 11 clear actions of what is needed in order to really transform our food systems. And secondly, I would like to also ask our participants to not forget to download our Whova app. The Whova app we use for the Q&A session, as well as to vote for the Twitter competition. So it's very important that you guys download this, and the instructions should be appearing on screen. All right. And with that, I would like to give a context for today's session. And I would like to first start with a cartoon, and if you can show the presentation. And you guys may see on this cartoon an image of a scientist or a climate scientist trying to portray the issue of climate change. And as you can see that during the 80s and 90s, humanity realized that climate change is increasingly becoming an issue, with carbon emissions making the atmosphere and changing the way that the heat is being trapped on Earth. And by the 2000s, scientists have already had a substantial amount of understanding on how this is affecting our planet systems and as well as humanity. And I'm sure that you guys have also learned about this, because back in primary school when I was only 8 years old, I remember this word global warming really becoming aware among even my friends at that time. And surprisingly now, 15 years after for myself and actually studying about climate change, I've been quite frightened by the silence and the lack of action that is needed to create this transformative change in the way that we are currently doing in order to stop and halt the global warming. And you can stop the presentation now, thank you. And I just want to draw our attention back to a time of during the 80s, and you might remember that humanity also faced a grave challenge back then as well. We were facing the challenge of the ozone layer, and the cause for that was due to the fact that we were emitting too many what they called CFCs, which is a cooling gas that was used for air conditioners or refrigerators, and we were emitting so much of it that we were creating a hole in the ozone. And at that moment in time, when we were posing an existential threat to the planet as well as ourselves, humanity came together and created a policy framework called the Montreal Protocol that actually was able to halt this process. And coming back to now on the issue of climate change, I think it also poses that same existential threat, but definitely the solutions to it is very different. And in fact, it's not just one silver bullet, but rather it requires a systemic change that, dare I not say, requires a complete revolution in our own behaviors as well as within our policies and economic system. And of course, this assembly makes the affluent afraid. They become antagonized by the abrupt change and anxious to give up their power. But it comes a time when our generation that will be living in the future must come together and stand up and create this change. And no doubt you must have seen on the news already, but there's been countless movements, for example, by Greta Thunberg and her climate strikes, or so many other global movements going on around the world, telling our politicians to act. And you can feel that vigorous and pulsating sense of injustice that many of these youths feel that we're doing to the planet and our people. And harnessing this power, it is indeed very important, because this power can create change. And I believe that science can help direct us to the right direction. Science has shown us that climate change has become an issue, and we can provide also the potential pathways that we can do to alleviate this. Science can give us the solution to a climate that's becoming increasingly variable. It can provide us with the solutions for the farmers who are losing their seasons over droughts, over changing rainy seasons, and even saline intrusion. And science can provide us with a solution to feed 10 billion people by 2050. For CCAFs, that issue is very important for us. And we're specifically also interested in the food systems, which is one of the key drivers for climate change, as well as one of the direct impacted by climate change. And of course, this calls for climate action and a major transformation of our food systems, as well as overall. And with that, I would like to set the context of the discussion today with that note, is how can we connect that science to youth movements to mobilize 10 million youth to create this transformation. And before we go into our session today, I would like to start with a quick quiz in order to engage with you, the participant. And I will display quickly here an instruction in terms of how the quizzing process will go. And it's important to note that this will be used for this quick quiz as well as for your voting for the Twitter competition, which I will show further instructions later. All right. And with that, let me start the first quiz for you. Since 2005, a global gathering of young people to address climate change and promote sustainability is held ahead of the annual UNFCCC Conference of the Parties. What is the name of this youth gathering? You guys can answer this question on Whova app, but I will also be showing the answer to this by the end for you to know the exact answer to this question. And please find further instructions. And yes, with that out of the way, I think we will be going into one of the parts that I'm sure a lot of our participants have been looking forward to, the Twitter competition. And regarding that, we've received quite a number of posts, and that has reached many people, and it's represented a wide range of audiences. And if you remember, we asked you to post a picture or a video about how you are contributing to the transition towards and the transformation towards a sustainable food system. And with that, I would like to show you the first post that received 522 likes, which is quite impressive. And the first post is by the Starving Farmer, and I will quickly read this to you. As you see, I am a young farmer from Malawi, helping farmers access high-quality seed for tuber crops. Potatoes, garlic, and ginger through seed multiplication, trainings for farmers, and market linkages under Agri Center for sustainable food systems and climate resilience. That's wonderful. And please remember that you will be voting for the top 3. So this is the first one. And our second post comes from Mama Mboga. And this post received 304 likes on Twitter. The context goes as follows. We empower Mama Mbogas to handle their stalls professionally by keeping books, selling clean food, and supporting small-scale farmers when sourcing produce. We want young girls to aspire to be Mama Mbogas. Ah, man, that's awesome. And I will keep the image on screen for a bit so you can get to see the content. All right. And our third post comes from Mambo Muntu Delroy Matenga. This post received 231 likes. Ours is a 1-hectare Pietro Rosa, or tomato, variety. We're on our second harvest with my friend Owen. We are targeting a good quality and nutritious yield by mid-July, and we've extended with another 0.5 hectares. Let's go, Mambo. That's awesome. I'll leave this on the screen again for you to view. The fourth post comes from Ssele Farmer. 111 likes. Nice number. I am a tomato farmer from Uganda. I advocate and work towards reducing food insecurity through agriculture with more specifications on homestead gardening. I also train and encourage women and youth to engage in agriculture for sustainable development. Great work, Ssele Farmer. And finally, our last post comes from Sustenario UFG. The organization promotes Brazilian biodiversity for sustainable diets, respecting the environment, seeking an interaction between the university and society based on science in an easy, accessible, and fast way. And it seems like some of the images shown here comes from one of their campaigns. Great work. And I would like to remind our participants to vote for the top 3 out of the 5 that you have just seen. And these are some clear guidance that we want to give you in order for you to find exactly where to vote. So first, so you have downloaded the Whova app already, but you can go to the Whova app, and I've highlighted here. You click on that tab that says polls, and just find the question with the name Twitter competition, driving social change for sustainable decisions, and just select the top 3 answers that you want, and we'll be tallying the votes, and then you can submit your answer. And we will be announcing the winners at the end. So please stay ahead. The poll will be open for the next 15 minutes. So please go ahead and vote. All right, thanks production team. You can bring the slide down in 10 seconds. And yeah, I would like to also ask our panelists today, what are some of your initial reactions to some of the posts? Amanda, you have any thoughts?
Yes, I do. I like the fact that it's a rich mix from across the agricultural value chain. We have advocacy, we have those who are directly involved in production, like the one from Malawi. And also we have Mama Mboga, who is helping them with the bookkeeping and financial literacy. So I like how it's rich and diverse from across the value chain.
Great. Cedric, you have any thoughts?
Well, I loved how they're very catchy. They have catchy names and brings someone like the beauty of agriculture. And then it shows also they tap the whole value chain, which is beautiful and powerful that way. I love it.
Yeah, awesome. Luke, you have any initial reactions? Luke, I think
I agree with Amanda. I really like the variety. I think that it really shows that there are so many different angles that people can contribute from, and so many different opportunities for people to get involved in the whole breadth of activities.
Yeah, most definitely.
I also like the name Ssele Farmer. I thought that was quite good.
Oh yeah, that one it got me too.
Yeah, and I think that's quite. It's somewhat representative of really of the food systems, right? I mean, it requires the transformation, but it requires a participation from many people along this chain. And I think with that, it sets quite a good context for us to go into the meat of the session today, is about discussing how we can transform the food systems and take on climate action. And I would like to first begin on the science spectrum of everything. And with Cedric, and to really understand how science can deliver informed decision making. And Cedric, let's start with you. And in the diverse context of where you're from, Rwanda, and also where you work in the U.S., what are the major disruptions you see to the food systems that really highlights that need for systemic transformation? And how is your work as a researcher and as well as CEO of a company addressing some of these challenges? And do you see a role that us youth can really play within this transformation? Over to you, Cedric.
Thank you, Nam. The COVID pandemic is exposing the fragility of the world's food system. The primary issue today has been the disruption of food supply and the demand. And in many countries in Africa, including Rwanda as well, in some places, farm production has stopped. And in other places, food is produced but cannot get to the market. And the food that gets to the market are too expensive for people to afford, due to the fact that a lot of people lost their jobs and incomes, and these are weakening the purchasing power, thereby limiting the demand. And this is a trend that is likely to accelerate. There are many other cases in countries, even developed countries like USA, Canada, UK, where farmers are forced to dump food because of COVID-related closures. Even though we know there are a lot of people who are insecure and hungry, and food are being dumped because they're not getting reached to the market. And this is happening not necessarily in Africa, but also in developing countries, like I said. And it is clear that the recent disturbing increase in food insecurity are not a result of scarcity, but a matter of logistics. We must address the immediate threat of hunger and food security now. and also take the opportunity to build a more resilient food production and distribution system that can withstand the next crisis. So I see the problem, food security, I like to call it a wicked problem, but I see that it requires a collective actions. In my work, I wear many hats and I try to get involved as much as I can through raising public awareness and advocacy and bridging the gaps between researcher and policymakers to help make the informed decisions. Many researchers, we as researchers, we mostly spend much time doing research, but we do not spend time getting to know policymakers and building relationships that can help make those informed decisions, and vice versa. This is just an example, but it's clear that it's one example among many, and it's clear that there is a big gap in interdisciplinary approach around food security. So we need to work together than before. And with a strong interdisciplinary collaboration, we can get the work done. So at both of my companies, both Quinoa Hub and Farmwella, we are establishing a system that helps farmers have access to market and make the product available for the consumers. This is the gap that has existed and still is existing in our farming system and in the international agricultural sector as well, and especially in developing countries, including Rwanda and other countries in Africa. And most importantly, we are focusing on engaging our fellow youth to embrace agriculture through the creation of hub centers, think tank platforms for information sharing and capacity building for all of us youth to work this journey together. Because we believe that as youth, we have the power and the potential to make the change. And we keep in mind that it is our responsibility to build a better world for us to live in and for the next generation to come. Thank you.
Thank you, Cedric. And very well said. I think youth does play a very much important role here, and the capacity building and connecting this is important. And that point actually connects a lot with what I'm going to ask Amanda here. And Amanda, you have been assisting youth and agri-entrepreneurs to participate in agriculture and actually causing a broad adoption of climate-smart agriculture that improves both food security, livelihoods, and resilience. With the challenges of climate variations in the coming decades, how have you been seeing youth uptaking transformative decisions to improve their agricultural systems? And I think it's also worth noting is, like, are you seeing also any barriers that is currently impeding upon this transformation?
Yeah, so this question comes perfectly after Cedric, because he said, researchers do a lot of, the science behind it, the research work, but there's also been a gap on information dissemination. So with the Climate Smart Agriculture Youth Network and other social movements that have been there, I'll speak for my country in Kenya. So there's all this information, but we find it's not getting to the people who need to put this information into practice. So what's been happening is that the youth have come in to use this particular information that's shared by scientists and share it with the farmers, because they themselves are farmers. We've also had like climate risk profiles, which is helping them now farm from an informed decision. So it's precision data. And also you had given the setting of this meeting that right now the seasons are changing. It's not the same way as it was before. There's also a weather app that will help farmers, know when to plant, as opposed to relying on, the seasons that were there before. So this perfect nexus between what the scientists are doing is helping, because this information is not going to be consumed and used by the scientists, it's being used by the farmers. So through this youth movement and youth networks, we are able to bridge that gap. And also when we look at the challenges is that there's a lot of disaggregated efforts in getting the youth involved in agriculture. We have different factions talking in different voices, and at the end of the day, we don't have a unified voice. So it would be important to have a unified youth voice that will be able also to inform, like policymakers on some of the challenges that they're facing on the ground, or have a feedback mechanism to the scientists who are busy in the labs and doing the research work. So it's a bi-directional communication. So those are some of the things that I would like to highlight on that.
All right. Most definitely. And definitely, I think that youth engagement, again, and the coalitions that's been mentioned, it's always a vital point in terms of how we are able to engage with youth within these processes that you have mentioned. And with that, I would like to also turn over to Luke as well. So Luke has been engaging a lot on the global policy level in Australia. And as I had mentioned earlier today during my introduction, is we know that these policy processes are being taken in place, but at the same time, the pace that it is coming in is not fast enough in order to really combat the impacts that we'll be facing in the future. And with that context in mind, Luke, I would like to ask you, with your experience engaging at this global level, do you think that current youth participation at these international conferences are helping to foster that policy change that supports this much needed transformation for food systems as well as climate action?
Yeah, thanks, Nam. And I think it's really inspiring to hear some people who are doing some great work on the ground with different approaches with Cedric and Amanda. And I think that youth through policy, the main forum is with the UNFCCC, as you've mentioned. So there's a group called YUNGO, which is the Youth and Children Constituency, which essentially any youth attendee of one of these conferences can join. And YUNGO has a dedicated agriculture group, which I'm part of, which really tries to advocate for greater prominence of agriculture and food systems at the UNFCCC, because food systems have only actually recently gotten attention at the UNFCCC despite being a quarter of global emissions. So young people have been part of those kind of calling for this action. And you mentioned, I don't want to give away the answer to one of your questions from earlier to the crowd, but that YUNGO does run an event called the Conference of Youth prior to each COP. And this is where people can really come together and build advocacy skills. And like Amanda said, it is really important to have a unified voice and position when speaking to policymakers. So here we try to come up with a position which represents that of youth attending. And through that, there's opportunity to speak on panels and also at the Coronaville joint workshops on agriculture, which are the main mechanism to discuss agriculture. And I think that one good example of what youth have been able to do is really try to question the assumptions going into the UNFCCC and also try to drive ambition. So I think one of the examples I've seen in this is that there's been, as I mentioned, agriculture has only recently been discussed at the UNFCCC, and that is primarily around production practices. So we know, as is discussed in the recent report, which this panel is related to, that we also need to look at dietary practices and food loss and waste. So young people attending COP25 handed out a survey which essentially asked people whether they would like dietary practices and food loss and waste to also be considered, and whether the UNFCCC should really show a good example of what sustainable food catering can be. And there was actually quite positive response to this, and it actually wasn't as controversial as people expected. So I think this is a really good example of youth questioning the long-standing assumptions and really trying to drive ambition. However, there are some challenges, despite many policymakers referring to, for example, climate strikes and referencing that as a source of increasing demand for climate action, I think that there are still challenges for young people to be engaged. So, for example, perhaps not being taken seriously or only invited to participate rather than be involved in the whole process of shaping these events and policy discussions.
All right. Yeah, I can you elaborate a bit more on your experience participating in these platforms, as you mentioned, and especially what barriers are you noticing that that might be stopping youth from further engagement and creating these changing decisions?
Yeah, so young people do have the opportunity to attend the events, but often the opportunities either end at participation or end at, for example, being invited to speak at an event which already has its direction established. So sometimes young people can feel like they have been invited to something once everything's already been decided, so that people can say, okay, let's tick the box, we've invited youth. Whereas when we try to have meetings with negotiators, for example, sometimes they don't take young people very seriously. For example, I was at one, I won't name the country, but we had a meeting with the negotiators of a big emitting country to try to understand what's going on, what's kind of driving their thinking with these negotiations. And they were really quite surprised and taken aback that we had any understanding of the UNFCCC process. So I think that there is a tendency for people to see the role of youth ending at striking, for example, and not really recognizing that young people can actually have a good opportunity and understanding of these processes. And then, of course, at the end of this discussion, then we'll ask to pose for a photo so the negotiators can let everybody know that they're speaking to youth. So I think that there is some degree of tokenism still, unfortunately.
I see. That's quite interesting, because first we talk about the need to engage youth in these platforms, but then it can't stop at that, as you had said, but it requires that further next move in terms of full integration and inclusion. And I've asked all of you about the barriers in terms of what challenges you're seeing, and Cedric, you've given a perfect example from the science, for example, and then Amanda, we've had a wonderful response from you as well in terms of the challenges you're facing at the local level and engaging with the youth. And then Luke, now you have the issues of the of the youth engaging at the global level. And I want to get some of your views in terms of how we can actually create this change. And of course, I mean, the change that we're talking about requires a massive, massive mobilization of the public consciousness. So just to phrase the question again, and this is going to be an open discussion, what concrete processes and actions can we think of that can link this collaboration between science and the great strength of these youth movements to foster the changes in the much needed food system? And Cedric, do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think first of all, we need to change our view. I'm going to speak on the food security or agriculture in general. So we need to change our view on agriculture. Agriculture is not a development activity or a social cause. We must see it as a business. So a lot of people think farmers are the cause of poverty. No, farmers are not the cause of poverty. They are a solution. And it's time to change the way we think. And the youth need society's full support to enter agriculture. And the farmers need to be respected. And their profession we must understand that their profession is crucial to every individual on the continent. Here, either Africa or Europe or USA, America, everywhere, and from today and decades to come. But particularly on Africa, until youth who comprise an estimate of 65% of African population, if they venture into agribusiness, if they don't venture into agribusiness, there is a little chance of ending hunger and poverty in Africa. And so what needs to be done? Because there is a lot of potential in youth, but we need the four things. I see them in the four things that need to be done to inspire our fellow youth to take up agriculture and enable their success. Now, this is, we need to celebrate agriculture entrepreneurs. We need to improve youth access to information and practical trainings, and improved access to technology, and most importantly, access to financial services. And these are responsibilities of all government and institutions all over the world. And we need, I would emphasize that we need more youth involvement right now than before, because there is no movement that has ever failed when it was led by youth.
Thanks a lot, Cedric, for that wonderful answer. Amanda, you have any thoughts?
I definitely do. I really like what Luke said, that it's not about tokenism or ticking boxes. When we have collaborative efforts with the youth at the table, I believe we can achieve much more. I really like what's been happening in Kenya, as I mentioned earlier, with the Climate Smart Agriculture Youth Network and CIAT, where they've been working together to actually disseminate this information. And we need more of such efforts where it's not just, having youth there to look good or fulfill a certain criteria, but actually working with them. And it's going to produce great results. So like right now with the climate risk profiles, who would have known about them? It would have just been sitting in the shells. But when you have the youth involved, they're on the ground and they're ready and willing to work. And we are knowledgeable and we are ready. So it's not just about taking to the streets, but we're also ready to work.
All right. And finally, Luke, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I really agree with Amanda. I think that youth need to be at the table. I think that it's one thing to have young people participate at events, but I think that one really concrete action that organizations such as UNFCCC could do is have young people on their advisory boards or similar mechanisms. So I know that there's one example I came across recently of Eat Forum, which has recently announced their advisory board, and there's actually 3 young people on that out of 30. And I think that I see that as quite a good opportunity compared to, I know that some people have a normal advisory board and then a youth advisory board. And I really think that it's valuable to blend them together so that then young people can be there and making sure that conversation is also leading to ambition and question those conversations that are happening rather than being a separate advisory board who doesn't really have access to what the other conversations are. So I think that I really would like to see young people involved in the whole process of agenda setting, the decision making, consultations in the lead up to events, follow-up, monitoring, also getting young people involved in asking exactly this. So an organization could speak to young people and say, how could we better include young people in our processes? Mm-hmm. And then have young people involved in the monitoring or evaluating of that, I think would be really valuable.
Mm-hmm. Thanks a lot, Luke. And I think all three of you make a very striking point about involving youth and it's interesting because when we talk about the transformation of food systems, it again requires an interaction at a lot of different levels as well as a lot of different fields, not only on the policy that you had mentioned, Luke, but also on the farm, engaging the youth, like Cedric and Amanda has mentioned. And I think that also shows the diversity as well when we talk about transforming and creating a so-called revolution, is that even though we might be connected by that same idea of resilience or of climate action, but even for myself, I'm from Vietnam, and I know that Amanda, you're from Kenya, Cedric, you're from Rwanda. I mean, we have very different interests in mind when we talk about transformation, and it's important as well to understand that difference between maybe in the North and the South, when the priorities are very different between the two regions, but at the end of the day, our hearts and our ideas are still connected with each other. And thank you for your remarks on that. And unfortunately, we don't have any more time for questions. I only had a chance to pose for one question. And before we actually go to the results and announcing the results, of the Twitter competition, which I know that everyone is very excited about. Let me quickly turn on the slide to show you actually the answer to the quiz question that Luke had actually spoiled during his speech. So the youth participation in the Conference of the Parties gathering is called the Conference of the Youth. And I think many of you got the Youth Climate Summit as answer. Personally, I think that sounds quite nice as well, but it's number 2. It's Conference of the Youth. Yes, with that, let's announce the winners of the competition. And please hear me clearly, since I will be announcing this by mouth. Number 1, the winner of our competition is Mama Mboga. That's number 1.
Hey, Mama Mboga.
Number 2, the one with the most liked name, Ssele Farmer.
Oh yeah, go say.
and finally, the last one, to our Brazilian friends, Sustenario FG, you're the 3rd winner. And I will be quickly showing you how you can actually receive the prize that we had posted on Twitter. And please pay attention to this slide. There's only 4 things you need to do, and then we can send you the prize. First of all, please take a selfie of our session currently. Or if you're watching this later, maybe a 5-minute delay, and you can take a video of the next upcoming session in 15 minutes. Post it on Twitter, and then once again, tag Amanda Namayi, and you can also tag @CCAFS, CCAFS, and use the same hashtag I used before, New Era for Food. And in terms of the content of the post, it will be great for us to know what you have taken away from this session. The key takeaway message from our conversation would be great to also understand your thoughts on that. And then once you've tagged us and used the hashtag, we will personally contact you for further details. All right. I hope you've been able to get that information. And with that, I would like to close the session today. Thanks a lot, Cedric, and Amanda and Luke for joining us. And it's so nice to actually have a conversation with youth, and especially from across the world about this. And it's
yeah.
I always think it's amazing that even though we don't speak the same language, mother tongue, but we're connected by the same language and by the same idea of a wish to contribute something to make that change. And it's very much respected, I believe. Yeah. You guys have any last words? Very short.
Well, I do look forward to having this conversation translated into action, and that the next time we have such a meeting of minds, that we will have concrete testimonies to give.
And for all the youth who are listening to us, I want to remind them that we have the power to make the change.
All right. Luke?
Yeah, I think that there's been some really inspiring examples tonight of people getting involved in food systems and agriculture. And I think I would encourage everybody to do the same.
All right. Thank you. And with that, I would like to close our session today. And participants, if you're still watching our webinar series or our session series on transforming food systems, there's plenty more coming. So after our session, we'll be breaking for 15 minutes. And then please tune in for our next session. And with that, thank you, everyone.